Victoria Langston was the epitome of success. As the CEO of Atlas Enterprises, she had built a reputation for her unrelenting drive and an almost preternatural ability to see through deceit. Her sharp eyes could dissect a corporate pitch in seconds, her razor-sharp mind always 3 steps ahead. Yet it was her ability to balance this commanding presence with a polished elegance that made her a force to be reckoned with. Her personal life, at least outwardly, mirrored the same perfection. Married for 15 years to Edward Langston, an accomplished architect with a disarming charm, they were often labeled a power couple. They had a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, 2 bright children in private school, and an enviable social circle filled with the city's elite. To anyone looking in, Victoria was living a life that others could only dream of. But dreams, as Victoria would soon discover, can hide nightmares. The evening began like many others in their well-heeled life. The Langstons hosted a small yet lavish anniversary dinner at their home. The dining room glowed with the soft golden light of crystal chandeliers. The scent of rosemary lamb wafted through the air as servers in crisp uniforms poured vintage wine into delicate glasses. Edward sat at the head of the table, leaning in with his effortless charm as he entertained their guests with anecdotes of his latest architectural masterpieces. Victoria, ever the poised hostess, smiled warmly at the right moments and nodded as their friends laughed. But something felt off. It wasn't anything overt, just a lingering tension, like a subtle shift in the air. She had first noticed it 2 weeks earlier when Edward casually mentioned that a new client, Melissa Grayson, had asked for his help with a custom home design. Melissa was a striking woman who had been at the periphery of their social circle for years. Victoria had dismissed the idea of anything more at first. Edward was always professional with his clients. But then came the offhand remarks. Late-night meetings, a business lunch, that stretched far too long, and the sudden surge of charm when she questioned him about it. "You're being paranoid, darling," Edward had said with a laugh, brushing off her concerns as if they were a joke. "Melissa's just difficult to pin down. You know how these high-maintenance clients are." Victoria nodded, forcing a smile, but the nagging unease refused to dissipate. By the time dessert was served that night, Victoria's doubts had evolved into quiet observations. Edward seemed almost too relaxed, too eager to deflect attention from himself. And Melissa, seated just 2 chairs down, had an ease with Edward that felt practiced. It was in the way her hand lingered just a second too long on his arm when he made her laugh. The way she tilted her head, her glossy hair cascading over her shoulder as her eyes locked on him. It wasn't overt, but to Victoria it felt like the crackling tension before a storm. What struck her most wasn't Melissa's behavior. It was Edward's. He was more attentive to Melissa than he'd been to Victoria in months, leaning in when she spoke, laughing a bit too hard at her quips. It was subtle but undeniable. The analytical part of Victoria's mind clicked into overdrive, cataloging each interaction with clinical precision. She excused herself from the table and retreated to the kitchen, feigning an issue with the caterers. Once alone, she leaned against the marble countertop, gripping the edge until her knuckles turned white. Her heart raced and her stomach churned with a mix of anger and humiliation. But she quickly reined it in. Victoria Langston did not break. Not in business, not in life. Later that evening, as the guests filtered out, Edward came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You've outdone yourself again, darling," he murmured into her ear, his tone smooth and warm. But the gesture felt rehearsed, his touch foreign. Victoria forced a smile, turning to kiss his cheek. "You're always so supportive," she replied, her voice a perfect mix of affection and exhaustion. But as she pulled away, her gaze lingered on Melissa, who was just leaving. Their eyes met briefly, and in that fleeting moment Melissa's smile faltered. It was a tiny crack in her polished veneer, but to Victoria, It spoke volumes. The game had begun. Victoria didn't know exactly what Edward was hiding or how deep the betrayal ran, but she was determined to find out. The analytical prowess that had built her empire was now directed at her own life. The cracks in her perfect world were widening, and she was ready to uncover what lay beneath. Victoria's days began to stretch unnaturally long as she juggled the demands of running Atlas Enterprises with the gnawing suspicion consuming her private life. She felt like an actress in her own life, playing the role of a devoted wife while her mind raced with questions and calculations. The facade held strong, but beneath it, the storm brewed. It started with subtle investigations. Victoria wasn't one to confront without evidence, so she began with Edward's routine. His meetings were meticulously noted in the shared family calendar, but certain gaps in his days seemed conspicuously vague. When she asked about them, he brushed her off with excuses about last-minute client calls or unavoidable traffic delays. His charm covered his inconsistencies, but not convincingly enough for Victoria. She remembered the moment she decided to dig deeper. Edward's phone, always buzzing with updates, had been oddly silent one evening. Curiosity, and something deeper, compelled her to pick it up when he stepped out to take a call. The lock screen displayed a notification. "Melissa Jean, thanks for today, you're amazing." Victoria's breath hitched. She felt a pang in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. If Edward was lying to her, it wasn't just personal. It was war. Victoria wasn't just a CEO. She was a strategist. Over the following week, she employed every tool in her arsenal. She enlisted her most trusted assistant, Elena, under the guise of investigating a potential business rival. Elena, a savvy and discreet operator, was more than capable of extracting information without raising alarms. "Track Melissa Grayson's movements," Victoria instructed, keeping her voice measured. "I need to know where she goes, who she meets, and how she spends her time." Elena raised an eyebrow but didn't question the request. Within days, the reports started coming in. Melissa frequented upscale restaurants, private art galleries, and exclusive lounges. Most tellingly, her activities often coincided with Edward's late meetings. Elena even uncovered a few photos of Melissa with Edward. Nothing damning, just professional enough to pass scrutiny, but far too frequent for Victoria's liking. The most significant clue came when Elena found a suspicious financial connection, a transfer from one of Edward's business accounts to a private fund linked to Melissa. It wasn't a substantial amount, but it raised an immediate red flag. Unless there was more to their relationship than he admitted. The turning point came on a cool autumn evening. Victoria, unable to shake the mounting evidence, decided to take matters into her own hands. Edward had left for another meeting, and Victoria followed him. She felt a mix of adrenaline and dread as she tailed his car through the city. He wasn't heading to a client's office or a boardroom. Instead, he stopped at a secluded restaurant on the outskirts of town. Victoria parked a safe distance away and watched as Edward stepped out, his confident stride unshaken by any guilt. Minutes later, Melissa arrived. She wasn't alone. A man Victoria didn't recognize accompanied her. Before she opened the door, Victoria observed from her car as the three of them entered the restaurant together. She debated her next move, heart pounding as she considered confronting them. But her instincts urged restraint. Storming in might provide satisfaction, but it wouldn't give her the clarity she needed. Instead, she called Elena. "I need details on a man who's with Melissa and Edward," she whispered. "Send someone here now. I'll text you the location." Elena didn't hesitate. Within the hour, a private investigator arrived, snapping photos and documenting the interaction. Victoria waited in the shadows, her thoughts churning. Why was this stranger meeting with Edward and Melissa? What business could they possibly share? 2 days later, Elena delivered the report, and the picture became clearer and darker. The man was Ryan Calhoun, a mid-level executive from Atlas Enterprises. According to the investigator, Ryan had been quietly moving company assets into shell accounts over the past 6 months. These accounts, as Victoria now knew, were linked to Melissa's private fund. Victoria's stomach churned as she pieced together the betrayal. Edward and Melissa weren't just involved in a personal affair, they were conspiring professionally. The transfers weren't random, they were part of a calculated scheme to siphon money from Atlas Enterprises. Ryan was the pawn, Melissa the mastermind, and Edward was complicit. The betrayal cut deeper than she imagined. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the empire she had built with her own blood, sweat, and tears. Edward wasn't merely cheating on her, he was undermining her legacy. Victoria didn't confront Edward immediately. She needed more leverage, more proof to ensure that when she struck, it would be decisive. She pored over every financial record, cross-checking timelines and transactions. With Elena's help, she uncovered a hidden email chain between Melissa and Edward, discussing their future plans with a mixture of veiled affection and business strategy. Phrases like "securing our escape" and "just a few more months" turned her stomach. What stung most was the emotional betrayal evident in their exchanges. Edward had written to Melissa with a tenderness Victoria hadn't seen in years. The man who once wooed her with love notes and thoughtful gestures had now reserved his affection for another woman, one who was gutting Victoria's company from the inside. The weight of the discovery didn't just bring heartbreak, it fueled a cold, burning rage. Victoria Langston was not a woman to be trifled with. She had built Atlas Enterprises from the ground up, and she wasn't about to let her husband and his mistress destroy it. Over the following week, Victoria began laying the groundwork for her retaliation. She initiated a discreet audit of the company's accounts, positioning it as a routine procedure to avoid raising suspicion. She also looped in her legal team, ensuring they were prepared to act swiftly if necessary. But her most strategic move came when she reached out to Ryan. Victoria invited him for a private meeting at her office, cloaking her intentions in a veil of casual professionalism. Ryan arrived nervous but unsuspecting. The lights were low and concise, and the male secretary was standing at his desk, propped up by a couple of pillows. "Ryan," she began, her tone warm but firm, "I've been reviewing some of our financials, and I noticed some discrepancies that lead back to you." His face blanched, and he immediately began stammering excuses. Victoria let him flounder for a moment before leaning in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Save it," she said sharply. "I know everything. Melissa, Edward, the shell accounts. Don't insult me by pretending otherwise." She elbowed him in the side, daring him. "Let's play." She whispered into his ear. Ryan froze, his eyes wide with panic. I didn't mean to—" You didn't mean to get caught," she interjected coolly. "I'm giving you one chance to cooperate. Tell me everything, and I might be able to save your career. And your freedom." Ryan crumbled under her stare, spilling the details of their scheme. He revealed how Melissa had orchestrated the embezzlement, using Edward's connections and Ryan's position to siphon funds. Edward's role, according to Ryan, was less active but equally damning. He had turned a blind eye in exchange for Melissa's escape. Victoria's hands trembled as she listened, but she maintained her composure. Ryan's confession confirmed her worst fears, but it also armed her with the ammunition she needed. By the time she returned home that evening, the pieces of her plan were falling into place. Edward greeted her with his usual charm, oblivious to the storm brewing behind her calm facade. "How was your day, darling?" he asked, kissing her cheek. And Victoria smiled, her expression unreadable. "Oh, just another day at the office," she replied, her voice smooth as silk. But inside, she was already calculating her next move. Edward had no idea that his perfect world was about to collapse. Victoria Langston was no stranger to strategy, but this time the stakes were deeply personal. In the weeks following Ryan's confession, she shifted into overdrive, executing a plan that would leave no room for ambiguity or escape. Her goal was simple: expose Edward, Melissa, and their betrayal in a way that would ensure justice, both personally and professionally. She worked in silence, cloaking her actions in the usual demands of her high-profile career. From the outside, everything appeared normal. She attended board meetings, closed multi-million-dollar deals, and continued hosting the lavish social events that defined her lifestyle. But behind closed doors, she was building a case strong enough to unravel the web of lies. The first step was securing Ryan's cooperation. After their initial meeting, Victoria invited him to a secluded estate outside the city, a property she owned but rarely used. The house was intentionally chosen for its privacy, ensuring their conversation would remain confidential. Ryan arrived looking more frazzled than before, his guilt etched into every line of his face. Victoria, however, was calm and composed, her demeanor that of a queen addressing a subject. "Ryan," she began, her voice smooth but unyielding, "I need everything: documents, emails, bank transfers, anything that ties Edward and Melissa to this scheme." Ryan hesitated. "If I give you this, they'll know it was me. Melissa will ruin me." But what could he say? Melissa had already ruined much of his life. Victoria leaned forward, her steely gaze locking onto his. "Melissa already has her claws in you. The only way to free yourself is to align with me. Help me take them down, and I'll ensure you're protected." Her words hung in the air, heavy with both promise and threat. Ryan nodded reluctantly. "I'll give you." "You have more?" "I have." The next day, a secure courier delivered a package to Victoria's office. Inside were copies of incriminating emails, detailed spreadsheets showing the embezzlement trail, and even photographs of Edward and Melissa together. Some professional, others decidedly less so. Victoria pored over the evidence, her fury tempered by the satisfaction of having hard proof. Victoria knew she couldn't take on Edward and Melissa alone. She needed allies, but she also needed to control the narrative. If the story broke too soon, they would have time to cover their tracks. If it broke too late, the damage to Atlas Enterprises could be irreparable. Her first call was to her head of legal, a sharp-witted woman named Monica Choi. Monica was one of the few people Victoria trusted implicitly. When Victoria laid out the situation, Monica's eyes widened, but she quickly masked her shock. "This is explosive," Monica said, flipping through the documents. "But it's also actionable. We can use this to initiate legal proceedings, but we'll need to be meticulous. If even one piece of evidence is questionable, they'll exploit it." Victoria nodded. "I don't just want a legal win, Monica. I want to destroy their credibility. This needs to be airtight." Next, she approached Charles, her CFO. A meticulous numbers man, Charles had been with Atlas Enterprises since its inception. His loyalty was unshakable, and his expertise in forensic accounting would be crucial. When Victoria revealed the financial discrepancies, Charles was livid. "They've been bleeding us dry," he fumed. "Do you know how much damage this could have caused if it continued unchecked?" "That's why we're stopping it now," Victoria said. "I need you to trace every dollar. Build a report so comprehensive they can't deny it." With Monica and Charles on board, Victoria began assembling a team of trusted individuals within Atlas. Each person was given a specific task, ensuring no one had the full picture. The secrecy was vital. Edward was still attending board meetings, smiling as if nothing was amiss, completely unaware that his wife was dismantling his scheme from within. While Victoria focused on Atlas, she also turned her attention to her family life. The betrayal wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Edward's duplicity gnawed at her, not only as his wife, but as the mother of their 2 children. Their son Ethan was 14 and just beginning to show signs of following in his parents' ambitious footsteps. Their daughter Grace was 10 and still blissfully innocent. Victoria was determined to shield them from the fallout, but she also knew she couldn't hide the truth forever. One evening, as Edward played a board game with Grace in the living room, Victoria watched from the doorway. His laughter, his affection for their daughter, it all seemed genuine. But now, Victoria questioned everything. How could he separate his betrayal from his role as a father? Did he even feel guilt? Or was he so consumed by his own desires that he didn't care? Later that night, as Edward slept, Victoria sat in her home office, staring at an old photo of their wedding day. She remembered the vows they had exchanged, the promises they had made. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. There would be time for mourning later. For now, she needed to stay focused. The next major step in Victoria's plan came during the annual Atlas Enterprises Gala, a glittering event attended by industry leaders, investors, and media. It was a night meant to celebrate the company's achievements, but for Victoria, it was an opportunity. She arranged for Melissa to receive an invitation, knowing Edward would ensure she attended. The gala was the perfect setting for Victoria to observe them together without arousing suspicion. Dressed in a sleek black gown, Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her smile masking the storm within. She kept a careful eye on Edward and Melissa, who were mingling with a small group of investors. Their body language was subtle but telling. Edward's hand lingering on Melissa's back, Melissa's laugh just a bit too intimate. Victoria approached them with a glass of champagne in hand, her smile razor-sharp. "Melissa, how lovely to see you here," she said, her tone warm, but laced with an undertone that only Melissa would catch. Melissa hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding, "Victoria, always a pleasure." Edward, oblivious to the tension, placed a hand on Victoria's shoulder. "Darling, you look stunning tonight." Victoria's gaze flickered to his hand, then back to his face. "Thank you, Edward. It's wonderful to see you so relaxed." Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her confidence faltering under Victoria's piercing stare. The moment was brief, but it was enough to confirm what Victoria already knew. Melissa was unraveling. The next day, Victoria received the final piece of the puzzle. Charles had completed his forensic analysis, and Monica had drafted the legal documents needed to initiate action. Together, they outlined a strategy to expose Edward and Melissa in both the courtroom and the boardroom. Victoria's heart ached as she reviewed the evidence one last time. This wasn't just about protecting her company, it was about reclaiming her life. She had trusted Edward implicitly, shared her dreams and her vulnerabilities with him. And now, he had turned those dreams into a weapon against her, and there was no turning back. But Victoria wasn't just a victim, she was a survivor, and she was ready to fight. As the sun set on another day, Victoria sat in her office, a glass of wine in hand. She thought about the life she had built, the sacrifices she had made, and the betrayal she was about to confront. She didn't know how Edward would react when the truth came crashing down, but one thing was certain: she would emerge victorious. They had stayed so close. Tomorrow the facade would shatter, and the real battle would begin. The day Victoria had been meticulously planning for finally arrived. It began like any other, a brisk morning jog through Central Park, a perfectly tailored suit for the boardroom, and a series of high-stakes meetings that demanded her sharp attention. But today was different. Beneath her calm exterior, every step was deliberate, every word measured. She had constructed the perfect trap, and now it was time to spring it. The boardroom at Atlas Enterprises was a testament to Victoria's success. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, and the long marble table, flanked by high-backed leather chairs, was the stage for countless deals that had cemented Atlas's dominance. Today, however, it would serve a different purpose. Edward entered the room with his usual charm, greeting board members with handshakes and genial small talk. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable, unaware of the storm brewing behind the scenes. Victoria waited until the meeting was in full swing, discussing projections for the next fiscal year. When the conversation turned to finances, she nodded to Charles, who smoothly transitioned into his presentation. "As you can see," Charles began, pointing to a graph on the large screen, "Atlas has maintained steady growth this quarter. However, there's a concerning anomaly we need to address." The room fell silent. Edward's expression stiffened ever so slightly, but he maintained his composure. The judges resigned and signed to the court. The judge proceeded, Charles continued, detailing a series of financial discrepancies. As he spoke, Victoria watched Edward closely, noting the flicker of unease in his eyes. Melissa's name came up next, linked to suspicious transfers, and Edward shifted in his seat. The board members, initially confused, now leaned forward, their attention razor-sharp. Finally, Charles concluded, "These anomalies are tied to a series of unauthorized transactions linked to Melissa Grayson and, indirectly, to Edward Langston." Gasps rippled through the room. Edward's face darkened as he attempted to interrupt. "This is ridiculous!" Victoria raised a hand, her voice slicing through his protest. "Let him finish, Edward." When Charles wrapped up, Victoria took the floor. She stood tall, her presence commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is the result of weeks of investigation. It pains me to say that this betrayal comes from within, someone I trusted implicitly." As the author of the United States Senate's grand twin sister, she turned to Edward, her gaze cold. "Edward, you've embezzled funds from Atlas Enterprises, colluded with Melissa Grayson, and betrayed this company." Edward's jaw tightened, his voice rising in indignation. "This is preposterous. You're basing this on circumstantial evidence." "Circumstantial?" Victoria interrupted, her voice calm but lethal. She nodded to Monica, who handed out folders to each board member. Inside were copies of emails, financial records, and photographs. Irrefutable evidence of Edward's deceit. The room buzzed with whispers as the board members reviewed the documents. Edward's face turned pale, his confidence unraveling. Luca Aisha moved closer to the board. "This is a witch hunt," he spat, but his voice wavered. "You're doing this because you betrayed me?" Victoria snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "Because you jeopardized the company I built with your selfish greed and reckless behavior? No, Edward, this isn't personal. This is business." Meanwhile, Melissa was completely unaware of the storm about to engulf her. She was at a midtown cafe, sipping a cappuccino and reviewing architectural plans for a new project, an endeavor funded, unbeknownst to her, by Atlas Enterprises' stolen money. Her phone buzzed. It was a call from Edward. "Edward," she said breezily, "I'm in a meeting." She held up her phone for his to see. He clicked the button, checking the time of the meeting. "Melissa?" Edward hissed, his voice panicked. "It's over. She knows everything." "Yes," Melissa growled. The color drained from Melissa's face. "What are you talking about?" "She's got the board, the lawyers, the damn CFO, everything. She's going to destroy us." Melissa's mind raced. "Calm down. We can fix this. She has the proof," Edward snapped. "You don't fix this. You run." "Yes." Dick nodded. Before Melissa could respond, her phone buzzed with another notification. This one from a news outlet. She opened it, her heart sinking as she read the headline. "Betrayal at Atlas. CEO's husband and mistress, caught in embezzlement scandal. Victoria had planned every detail, including the timing of the media leak. By the time the board meeting ended, reporters were already camped outside the building, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as Victoria stepped out. Her demeanor was impeccable, poised, unshaken, and resolute. "Mrs. Langston, do you have a comment on the allegations against your husband?" a reporter called. Victoria stopped, her gaze steady. Atlas Enterprises has always held itself to the highest standards of integrity. While this betrayal is deeply personal, my responsibility is to this company and its people. We will not let the actions of a few compromise our future. The reporters clamored for more, but Victoria walked away, her head held high. The message was clear. She was in control. At home that evening, Edward confronted Victoria. He stormed into her office, his face red with fury. "You've destroyed me," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Victoria looked up from her desk, her expression cold. "You destroyed yourself, Edward. Don't blame me for exposing the truth." "You've humiliated me," he spat. "I've lost everything, my reputation, my career, and I've lost 15 years of my life to a man who lied to me," Victoria shot back. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoyed uncovering how little you valued me or our family?" Edward fell silent, his rage deflated by her words. "This isn't just about us," Victoria continued, her voice firm. "You jeopardized the livelihoods of thousands of employees. You betrayed every single person who trusted you. And for what? A woman who is using you as much as you were using her?" Edward's shoulders slumped, his bravado finally crumbling. "I never meant for it to go this far," he muttered. "But it did," Victoria said. "And now you'll face the consequences." Over the next few weeks, the fallout was swift and severe. Monica and her legal team filed lawsuits against Edward, Melissa, and Ryan. The embezzled funds were traced and recovered, minimizing the damage to Atlas Enterprises. Melissa's architectural firm crumbled under the weight of the scandal, her name now synonymous with fraud. Edward, stripped of his wealth and reputation, attempted to negotiate a settlement, but Victoria held firm. "You don't negotiate with betrayal," she told Monica. "You crush it." The children, meanwhile, were shielded as much as possible. Victoria ensured they continued their routines, surrounded by love and stability, despite the chaos. She explained the situation to Ethan and Grace in simple, honest terms, emphasizing that they were not to blame for their father's actions. The final chapter of Victoria's plan came during a press conference, where she announced a new initiative at Atlas Enterprises, the Integrity Fund, aimed at supporting ethical business practices and whistleblowers. It was a bold move, one that solidified her reputation as a leader who could turn adversity into opportunity. When asked about her personal life, Victoria replied, "This experience has been a painful reminder that trust is both fragile and invaluable. I've learned to value those who stand by me and to let go of those who don't." Months later, Victoria sat in her now quiet home, reflecting on the journey. The house felt different without Edward's presence, but it also felt lighter. She sipped a glass of wine, gazing out at the city skyline. The scars of betrayal remained, but so did her resolve. She had faced the unthinkable and emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for her company and her family. Justice had been served, and while the wounds might never fully heal, Victoria knew one thing for certain: she would never let herself be blindsided again. Your abdication. Victoria sat in the quiet solitude of her study, the low hum of the city outside her window offering a sense of normalcy she hadn't felt in months. The storm had passed, but its aftermath still lingered in the crevices of her life. Her empire was intact, her name vindicated, yet the personal toll was undeniable. She had been betrayed, not only as a wife, but as a partner, a confidant, and a believer in the sanctity of the bonds she thought she'd built. Edward's absence was palpable, but it wasn't the absence of his presence that struck her. It was the absence of trust, of the belief that he had ever truly been on her side. She thought back to the early days of their relationship, to the charm that had swept her off her feet and the promises they had made to each other. Those memories now felt like artifacts from another life, tarnished by the knowledge of how easily he had discarded their shared history for greed and lust. Melissa's downfall had been swifter than Victoria anticipated. The court proceedings revealed layers of deceit that even Victoria hadn't uncovered. Melissa had not only manipulated Edward, but had a history of exploiting powerful men for her gain. She had been a phantom, weaving her way through social circles with practiced grace, leaving ruin in her wake. The media feasted on her story, painting her as the ultimate femme fatale. Victoria, however, refused to indulge in public vindication. She didn't need the world's validation to know she had won. Atlas Enterprises, once on the brink of scandal, emerged stronger than ever. The Integrity Fund became a cornerstone of the company's mission, earning it widespread praise and reinvigorating its reputation. Investors who had been hesitant returned, and the board's confidence in Victoria grew to an almost reverential level. Yet, despite the professional triumph, she felt an emptiness that success couldn't fill. Her children, Ethan and Grace, were adjusting to their new reality. Ethan, perceptive beyond his years, had asked her once, "Did Dad ever really love us?" The question had cut through her like a blade. She had knelt before him, holding his hands, and assured him that love, no matter how flawed, had been there. "People make terrible mistakes, Ethan," she had said. "But that doesn't erase the good parts of what came before. You and Grace are proof of that." In her moments of quiet, Victoria found herself grappling with the idea of forgiveness. Not for Edward. She couldn't bring herself to consider it, but for herself. She had to forgive herself for not seeing the signs sooner, for believing in the facade he had so carefully crafted. The betrayal had been so calculated, so precise, that it left her questioning her own instincts. If she could miss this, what else might she be blind to? The thought haunted her, even as she resolved to trust herself again. One evening, months after the dust had settled, she attended a charity gala. It was her first major public appearance since the scandal, and the room buzzed with whispers as she entered. Dressed in a deep emerald gown, she moved with the confidence of someone who had not just survived, but thrived. She met the curious gazes head-on, her smile poised, her steps measured. The whispers soon turned to admiration. This was Victoria Langston, the woman who had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, a phoenix rising from the ashes of her personal hell. On the screen, featuring likes of Hollywood's Dr. Strange, Tommy Weldon, and generous Grimsfield, a man approached her during the event, someone she vaguely recognized from the corporate circuit. His name was Alexander Drake, a venture capitalist with a reputation for sharp intellect and a dry wit. They exchanged pleasantries, and he surprised her with a question that lingered long after the conversation ended. "How does it feel," he had asked, "to reclaim your narrative?" She had smiled, offering a polished response about resilience and strength. But the question stayed with her. Reclaiming her narrative wasn't about silencing the whispers or rebuilding her empire. It was about finding herself again. The woman she had been before Edward's betrayal wasn't coming back. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. She had been naive then, overly trusting, too willing to believe that love and ambition could coexist without conflict. Now she understood that the two often walked a razor's edge. On her way home from the gala, the city lights blurred as she stared out of the car window. For the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The anger had long since burned out, leaving only a quiet sadness. She wasn't mourning Edward. She was mourning the life she thought she had, the dreams she had shared with someone who never truly valued them. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a sense of peace. She had weathered the worst and emerged stronger, wiser. The cracks in her armor were still visible, but they were part of her now. a testament to her resilience. She thought of Ethan and Grace, of the future she was building for them, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Victoria Langston wasn't just a survivor. She was a force of nature, one who had learned to wield her pain as a weapon, her heartbreak as a shield. The world would continue to watch her, to speculate and whisper, but she no longer cared. Her narrative was her own, and she was the only one who could write its next chapter. And for the first time in a long time, she looked forward to the story yet to come.